Hello and welcome to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast, where each week, Pastor Jeff Cranston explores biblical theology that provides practical life applications in an understandable way. Thanks for joining us at the table. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Kitchen Table Theology. I'm your host, Tiffany Coker. Along with my dad, Pastor Jeff Cranston, we're seeking not only to help you know deep, solid biblical theology, but to know the Word of God and the promises of God that are given to us in His Word, all while holding to solid theological truths in your heart, soul, and mind. We are getting close to wrapping up our Bible overview series here. We have 2 episodes left after today, 2 more books of the Old Testament to get through. And then we will take a break until the new year. Through the holidays, I'm sure you'll miss us greatly. We'll be back in 2025, though, with a new season yet to be determined. So, Kitchen Table Theologian, if you have any questions you need answered or something that you would love for us to talk about here on the podcast, email us. It is pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org, and we will see what we can do with this new season and the new year. Dad, I ran across an article by Kendra Cherry, who is a psychosocial rehabilitation specialist. Very interesting title. But this article was about procrastination, which I am the queen of, I'm pretty sure. But Dad, do you remember a time when you thought you had a week left to finish some project, but it really was due the next day? Or there's just something that you really have to do, but there's no timeline for it, no due date, and you just keep putting it off because I don't feel like doing it right now. Did that ever happen to you?
No, that's never happened to me outside of high school and college. And yesterday, because I really, in high school, I just didn't do it. And in college, I procrastinated like crazy because I heard these things about all-nighters. And I thought, well, that kind of sounds fun, when you're young and dumb. And then I realized they're not so much fun. But I was up against something like that, but I got it completed yesterday, or I thought I did, until you reminded me I still have one more to go.
That's right.
So I'll have to do that today.
Well,
you've described it exactly.
I must have gotten that from you. I love to procrastinate. But in this article, Kendra reminds us that sometimes we assume projects won't take as long to finish as they really do. It leads us to a false sense of security when we believe that we still have plenty of time to complete these tasks. And I think she mentions this in the article, one of the biggest factors contributing to procrastination is this notion that we have to feel inspired or motivated to work on a task at a particular moment. But the reality is that if you wait until you are in the right frame of mind to do certain tasks, especially these undesirable ones that we want to put off, you probably find that the right time simply never comes along. The task never gets completed. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's very true because you find yourself wanting to, you sort of have to gear yourself up, get in the right frame of mind, get motivated for it. And I think what she's saying there is that's what feeds procrastination, because a lot of this undesirable tasks that you have to do, you never get motivated to do them. So it's just better to, grin and bear it and buckle down and do it. But, all of that, this last thing that I still haven't done completely, although I've done 90% of it, but I thought I had done 100%. Waiting until you get in the right frame of mind, that did not happen for me. So anyway, I think, we should just do it whether we feel like it or not.
Exactly. I'm never going to be in the right frame of mind to want to vacuum my house, but the house has to get vacuumed, so you've got to get it done, right? Even simple, basic tasks.
I would strap 3 children to 3 vacuum cleaners and let them go to town on that.
Yes. But that's what the experts are telling us. You have to just go ahead and get the task done, whether you feel like it or not. And let's get started here with Haggai. The reason why we started with procrastination today is it appears in a much more important form in the book that we're looking at today, which is the Old Testament prophetic book of Haggai. So, Dad, go ahead and get us started here. What do we know about Haggai?
Well, what we don't know is if we're pronouncing the name correctly.
Yes.
So
I think I've said it 2 different ways already.
Some people call it Haggai, others call it Haggai. I don't know that it matters that much, but we'll see how we do as we go forward. So we know that is often the case in these books. The prophecy bears the name of its author. So the author of the book is Haggai. And he's simply identified as Haggai the prophet or the prophet Haggai. Nothing is known of his personal history, although he is mentioned twice in the book of Ezra. He and Ezra were contemporaries. So these 2 books, Haggai and Ezra, they are sort of hand in hand. And therefore, he's mentioned twice in the book of Ezra. Haggai's got an interesting name meaning, and his name means festal one, Festal, festal one, which likely means that he was born on a Jewish feast day, one of the feast days in the Jewish calendar. By the way, Haggai is the second shortest book in the Old Testament. It's only 2 chapters long. It's very short. So, Kitchen Table Theologian, here's a little quick quiz. Do you recall the shortest book in the Old Testament? Tiff, how about you? Do you recall?
I'm guessing it was one of our minor prophets that we just recently covered. But there were so many that were so short. I don't think I could name the shortest one.
Obadiah is the shortest Old Testament book. And the reason I bring that up is when I was doing my research for this podcast, I was reading somebody, and they mentioned how Haggai is the shortest book in the Old Testament. And I said, hold on a second, that doesn't sound right. And it's not. It's the second shortest book in the Old Testament. So Haggai, Obadiah is shorter. And we find that the book of Haggai is quoted, interestingly, 1 time in the New Testament. And we find that in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 12:26 is a quote from Haggai 2:6. And that's interesting because a number of them, what we call the minor prophetic books, are not quoted that often in the New Testament. So although his personal history is scarcely known, Haggai was extremely practical in his ministry. He was a man of God raised up at a specific time for a specific mission, which is the MO of all of these prophets.
And it feels like to me that as we're looking back on all these books that we've studied, talking about the Old Testament prophets here, we rarely know much about the author or it feels like God has maybe obscured the origin of each of these prophets. Do you think there's a reason for that? Am I even correct in thinking that?
Yeah, I think you are. And we do see that. I believe the reason may be that the message these prophets were bringing from God were all important, and God didn't want the messengers getting in the way of the messages.
That makes sense, yes. Okay, well, tell us a little bit more about Haggai and specifically his message that he was bringing to the people of God.
All right, well, to set us up before I answer that, how about reading chapter 2, verse 3 for us, please?
Does anyone remember this house, this temple, in its former splendor? How, in comparison, does it look to you now?
Okay, so that's Haggai saying that. Does anyone remember this temple as it used to be in all of its former splendor and glory? So some have inferred from that verse that Haggai was born in Judah and was one of a small company still alive who had seen the former temple in Jerusalem in its glory, the one that Solomon built. If this is true, this would make him at least 70 years old when he wrote this prophecy. So Haggai began his ministry in 520 BC. And what was that? To exhort the people, the Jewish people, to complete the task of rebuilding the temple. Now, hear that. Complete the task of rebuilding the temple. So the temple had started to be rebuilt, and then they let it go. And so God sent Haggai and Ezra, hey, get started again. There's where the procrastination tie-in comes in. If you're wondering, Kitchen Table Theology, why are they talking about procrastination? They procrastinated. They started it. They didn't finish it. Now God sends two prophets, Haggai being one. Hey, complete the task of rebuilding the temple. So when it resumed, it aroused opposition, and a letter was sent to King Darius about this, which took him 2 years about to receive, because he had a hand in all of this. Haggai, back to him, his ministry was short. It only lasted about 4 months as a prophet. And his prophecy, though, was sufficient motivation to get the people started again. So the work that Haggai, began was carried on by Zechariah and Malachi. And his prophecy takes place in Jerusalem, where the temple was being rebuilt. That we know those things about him.
So Haggai is calling them to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. It's been in ruins for years. Some rebuilding had started, but by the time that we meet Haggai, nothing has been going on in the rebuilding for about 10 years.
Which is about the same amount of time some of us have projects in our garage going. It's been about 10 years, right?
We procrastinate on those too.
Yeah, so, that's right, 10 years. So in 538 BC, because of the proclamation of Cyrus the Persian, he was the Persian king. We read about that in Ezra 1, 2, 3, and 4. Israel was allowed to return from Babylon to her homeland, not to just go back to life as normal, but they were going to live under the civil leadership of a guy named Zerubbabel and the spiritual guidance of a guy called Joshua, not the Joshua from the early days, but another Joshua, also called Jeshua. And he was the high priest. So Cyrus said to the Jews, all right, you may go back, and the high priest you can do your thing and practice your religion, but you're not going to have a king. You're going to live under my man by the name of Zerubbabel. And those two men, Jeshua and Zerubbabel, are named in the first verse of the book. And what we know is about 45 to 50,000 Jews returned. So this was major. In 536 BC, 2 years later, they began to rebuild the temple. That correlates with Ezra 3 through 4. But then there was opposition from neighbors. There was indifference among a lot of the Jews, and that caused the work to be abandoned. 16 years later, Haggai and Zechariah were commissioned by the Lord to stir up the people, not only to rebuild the temple, but also to reorder their spiritual priorities. So it took quite a while. 10 years, it turns into 16. And so they realized pretty quickly, we don't only have a construction problem, we have a spiritual problem, because everybody's spiritual priorities are all out of whack. And understandably so, because they have not been a worshiping people. They've been living in the captivity in Babylon and so forth. And so there's a lot to do to get all the balls rolling again.
And we do know that as a result, the temple was completed 4 years later. So, Dad, you maybe have touched on a few little theological themes already, but how about share with us specifically, what are some theological themes that we find in this very short book?
Yeah, and I'll just say as an aside, the temple they rebuilt was the temple Jesus was at.
Wow.
Yeah, so good thing that they did it, and then it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So it lasted about 500 or 550 years. But yeah, the one they rebuilt is the one that Jesus knew as a child and as a man. So, the immediate purpose on the theological theme, the immediate purpose of the book is to encourage the people to resume the building of the temple, which had been incomplete, as Tiff, you noted, for about 10 years. It was imperative that the people build the temple, for God had called them to do that, and we know that blessing always follows obedience. So the primary theme of the book is rebuilding the temple. And it had been lying in ruins since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. That was all the way back in 586 BC. So it had been in ruins for decades. So Haggai comes along, exhorts the people to renew their efforts, build the house of the Lord. And he motivated them. What a motivation. He said, hey, the drought that we've experienced, the crop failures that we have experienced, these things have been caused because our spiritual priorities have been misplaced. God's using these natural things to get our attention, rebuild the temple. But to Haggai, rebuilding of the temple was not an end unto itself. The temple represented, you got to think about this, the temple represented God's manifest presence among and with his chosen people. So the destruction of the temple of Nebuchadnezzar, the departure of God's dwelling glory, left at that point. That's when he departed, his presence departed. So to the prophet, Haggai, the rebuilding of the temple was going to invite the return of God's presence amongst his people. So he used the present situation they found themselves in as a springboard. And Haggai dove into the supreme glory of this ultimate messianic temple yet to come. So he's talking about the real temple, build the real temple, and yet in the book he turns to the Messiah and the ultimate temple that the Messiah will one day come and build. So he's encouraging the people with the promise of greater peace and prosperity and divine rulership and national blessing. Not only, he says, can this happen in our lives, but he's also drawing their attention to what we now call the millennium.
All right. As always, we like to wrap up each podcast, which we probably need to start doing here, by drawing our attention to how can we apply what is in this book to our lives in the 21st century. So, Dad, what do you have for us today to apply this to our lives here?
Well, when we read the book of Ezra alongside of Haggai, we quickly realize that the Jews faced both external and internal opposition in rebuilding the temple. The enemies of Judah first attempted to infiltrate the ranks of the builders, so they were trying to stop it that way, but that didn't work. And so they resorted to scare tactics. And then you had all that going on. Then Haggai, on the other hand, focused on the internal opposition they faced, namely from their own sin. The Jews had thoughtlessly placed their own interests before the Lord's interests, looking after their own safety and security without giving consideration to the status of the Lord's house. So we know this because God himself asks them, why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins? So God cuts to the quick right away. That's in the first chapter. So Haggai's encouragement to rebuild the temple in the face of the Jews' neglect brings to mind the Apostle Paul's, and here's the application for us, the Apostle Paul's exhortation to Christians to build our lives on the foundation of Jesus Christ. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 3. Because of God's grace to me, I have laid the foundation like an expert builder. Now, others are building on it. But whoever is building on this foundation must be very careful, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one we already have, Jesus Christ. So, Kitchen Table Theologian, to bring application to you and I today, I think we could ask ourselves, am I building my life, or am I building a life that reflects my status as a temple of the Holy Spirit? Am I leaving a legacy that will stand the test of time? And I think Haggai naturally draws us into that kind of introspection.
It's a great question to leave us all with today. Thank you so much for listening to Kitchen Table Theology Podcast with Pastor Jeff Cranston. If you are enjoying the podcast, would you consider taking just a second to leave a rating or a review on iTunes? We really do appreciate your help in getting the word out. Don't forget, you can check out today's episode notes and more at jeffcranston.com. You can also email us. As we said at the beginning, it is pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. Anytime you have questions or something that you would love to hear talked about on the Kitchen Table Theology podcast, we would love to hear from you. As always, thanks are due to our friends at Low Country Community Church here in Bluffton, South Carolina, and at Streamline Podcasts for making this podcast possible. Next week, we will be back, Lord willing, continuing our Bible overview series with the book of Zechariah. Until then, always remember that the real power of theology is not only knowing it, but applying it. Thanks for joining us at the table.
You've been listening to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast with Pastor Jeff Cranston. Join us next time for more insights into biblical truth. If you'd like to know more on today's topic, please check out our show notes. If you have a question from today's podcast, kindly email us at pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you consider leaving a rating and review? We deeply appreciate your help in getting the word out. And be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or in your favorite podcasting app to continue this journey with us as we learn about and apply God's Word to our lives. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time here at Kitchen Table Theology.